Hey guys, Brian here. This week we are jumping into the virtue of prudence. If you haven't already, go ahead and listen to the definition of prudence before you listen to this one. The definition is very short, but it'll provide context for the discussion you're about to hear. This week, Stephen and I talk about the misconceptions surrounding prudence. As you'll find out, the modern understanding of the word, if you hear it at all, is quite different than what we mean by the virtue of prudence. So much so that this is part 1 of 2 on the misconceptions of prudence. Before we get into the episode, I want to remind you that we are giving away Mansfield's Book of Manly Men. If you want to get on the drawing, make sure you invite any men you might know who would be interested or could benefit from our mission to our Facebook group before July 21st. Stephen and I appreciate everyone who has joined us so far and supported us. Help us to grow our brotherhood, and let's continue to grow as men. Right now, we can start by focusing on the virtue of prudence.
Hello, and welcome to the Vital Masculinity podcast. I am your host, Stephen Sloyer, and I'm here with my co-host, Brian Murphy. How you doing, man?
Pretty good, how are you?
Pretty good. So we have a great show tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about the misconceptions of the cardinal virtue prudence. And before we get into that, just a couple of quick announcements. The first thing, if you have not checked out our website, vitalmasculinity.org, please go ahead and do so. There you can find show notes, other resources for the show, and you can connect with us and learn about our story, about why we're trying to become better men and why we want to help you along your own journey. The second thing is you can check out our Facebook group. So if you just go to Facebook and search for Vital Masculinity, you can find our closed group there. The other thing is if you go to our website, as I just mentioned, there's also a link to the Facebook group on the header on the left. The last thing is we would love if you give us a rating and review. Please be honest with us. Give us, tell us what you really think about the show. And if you really think that this is making a difference in your life or that it will continue to make a difference in your life, please share this with your friends. We all know men that need a bit of guidance, need a little bit of motivation, kick in the rear to become better men. So we feel like if you share it, then you're doing the entire world and your community a real service. But on to the show tonight. We are talking about misconceptions about prudence. If you have not listened to our definition that we released previously, that serves as a resource for kind of a permanent definition of what prudence is, please go ahead and do so. You can find that on our website as well as any other place that you find that you can listen to this podcast. So, Brian, when you first heard the term prudence, what did you think that meant?
I think I would often think of it as, being calculated or cautious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that was very similar to mine as well. I definitely associated with maybe not wisdom, but, kind of being smart in a calculating way. But I really don't think that that's all there is to it, right?
Right. I think a lot of the times people can see it as maybe not even a good thing, like Machiavellian or even like cunning or something like that.
Yeah, and that's definitely tough because being prudent, this is the most fundamental virtue there is. It's why it's the first in all of the cardinal virtues. But at least, from my understanding, I think one of the misconceptions, the biggest misconceptions people have is that prudence is just being smart, or, if you want to use the word wise, it's just being wise. From my understanding, if you look at what Aristotle says, who defines prudence as right reason applied to practice, a lot of people leave off those last three words, applied to practice.
Right.
And wouldn't you find the same thing, Brian, when you're looking at the modern man's definition?
Yeah, I think in some ways people might even look at it as not even acting, like passive, like you don't even do anything.
Mm-hmm. So, like, you acquire a bunch of wisdom, read a bunch of books, and then you just sit around and pontificate on it?
Perhaps. I guess I'm thinking in my mind, like, maybe some... When I think of Prudence, like, it sounds like a person's name. Like, oh, Prudence, I know her. And what comes to mind is, like, some lady who's, like, sitting in her house and, oh, she's very prudent. She doesn't do anything bad. And she just kind of sits at home and, she's just be prudent at home.
Yeah, very prim and proper. And that makes sense. And I'd imagine for all you men listening out there that sitting at home and being like a prim and proper old lady named Prudence is probably not what you want to be doing on your Saturday nights. I think as men, we are really made to act, and action is definitely in our genes. And that's why I think getting over this first hurdle that Prudence is just pontificating on old books that you read is so vital.
Right. Yeah, and if we think about the other virtues, justice and fortitude and temperance, you really can't have any of these things if you're not prudent. You can't be just if you don't understand what it means to be just. You can't have fortitude if you're not looking at things the right way.
Sure. So what you're saying is that prudence, or I should say this. So what you're saying is that virtues don't exist in a vacuum, and that, prudence is defines. It kind of gives life to all these other virtues, because without wisdom, you're kind of drifting in a sea, right?
Exactly. If you don't have prudence, I would even go to the extent to say that you cannot be good in a conscious way.
So why is that?
Well, because prudence is recognizing reality as it is, objective reality. It's recognizing what is true, what is good. And if you don't recognize those things, you might be able to make what people might outwardly see as smart decisions, but really you're kind of just winging it, or you're acting out of ignorance, and that's not really a virtue. That's just dumb luck.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely a good way of looking at it. I think that there definitely needs to be a lot of direction when you're talking about being prudent. It's not just about, kind of being generally wise. You have to be wise about something.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, so if we think back to the last episode, we said prudence involves deliberation. You have to think about what's going on. It involves judgment. You have to make a choice. And then it involves action. So you're acting on it. So all those things kind of tied together to bring about what we know as prudence.
And that's interesting, because I think what you just laid out is a 3-step process to being prudent. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions, not just about prudence, but about pretty much all of the virtues in general nowadays, is that they're not something that's practical. They're something that is kind of, ephemeral, just kind of out there. And then, you're kind of lucky if you're prudent, or you're born that way, or things like that.
Right. I think a lot of people attribute it to being quote unquote smart. If you're not intelligent, then you're probably not very prudent. And maybe to some extent that's true, but at the same time, you don't have to be a genius to be a prudent person.
Right. And on the flip side, you can be a genius and not be prudent.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've talked to... Oh, go ahead, man.
Yeah, I was just thinking, what if we thought about maybe some examples of what it means to be imprudent? So kind of what things make something not prudent?
Okay.
Well, do you have anything that comes to mind, or?
Well, I think if we just look at the base definition, which is this notion of right reason and then applying it via action, I think you can kind of sever either half of the definition and get imprudence. There can be blind action, which is kind of dumb, which, right. If you're acting without any forethought, that is definitely something that would be imprudent. And I think if you look in your own personal lives, you'll find that, you're probably a lot happier when you actually plan things out. Whether it's your day, whether it's a large proposal or plan that you need to lay out there, having that actual forethought is really that it's important. It's that wisdom that is necessary before you take the action. And on the flip side, I would say that if you just lock yourself in a monastery and read a bunch of old books, you're not being prudent, because you're thinking about wisdom, but you're not acting. And as we kind of said when we defined virtue has really only come about in struggle. And yeah, there can be some struggle when you're thinking and contemplating things, but struggle really comes when you're actually acting, when you're putting yourself out there and making yourself actually work on a particular virtue.
Right. Yeah, I would say that obviously you have to spend time contemplating things to determine what is objectively true and how you might act on a situation. But I think that's the key there is you have to act on it. You can spend all this time thinking about it, but if you don't act, it's not prudence. You're just storing up knowledge. And actually, that kind of comes back to if we think about prudence. Joseph Pieper, quoting I think Thomas Aquinas, says that perfect prudence includes instantly grasping an unexpected situation and deciding with extreme quick-wittedness. So it's not necessarily you have to be sitting around, for hours trying to decide what to do, but you have to, take maybe even just an instant to think about, okay, what should I do here? And then you do it.
Oh, okay. So it kind of sounds like what you're saying, Brian, is that prudence isn't necessarily something that you have to learn in like a school or lecture setting, but it is something that in some parts can be instinctual.
Yes, I think that is true, but that instinct should come from. It probably has come through learning through a lecture or some other means. You've put in the effort to learn something, and then when it comes about, you've most likely practiced it a number of times, or at least thought it through a number of times, so that when it happens, it's kind of second nature. But it's not mindless because, in a sense, you've already taken the time to consider what you should do in this type of situation, and you're making a judgment and you're acting on it. So it's a little bit above an instinct because there was some sort of deliberation that happened, but it didn't necessarily need to take a long period of time, and it could have happened even years before a specific instance of where you're acting on something.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense, and I agree with you there. So another, and this is kind of a question for you, Brian, which is that we talk about virtue in many senses being the accumulation of good habits, right? We mentioned that in the first episode, we mentioned that in the second episode. So in what sense do you think that prudence can be acquired through habits? Because I think one of the misconceptions, as you alluded to before, is that people think that you're born smart, which in some senses is saying you're born prudent.
Right. So if we think about prudence, we're deliberating on something, we're making a judgment, and then we're acting. So essentially, if we think about those three components, working on each of those things is going to, in a certain way, help us to become more prudent. If we have practiced deliberating about things, if we don't just go about life just doing whatever feels right, but we actually think about things, and then we actually take and make a judgment. We don't just say, I don't know, it could be this, it could be that, maybe this, I'll just try something. But we actually make a decisive judgment on, okay, I thought about this. I've, developed my ability to reason. I've developed my assertiveness and decisiveness. And now I'm going to put this into practice. And kind of those three things are required in order to build up our ability to act prudently.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I see what you're saying there. And that I think is definitely a really great answer to that question. So what are some other misconceptions about prudence that you have come across in your studies of them? Any off the top of your head?
Honestly, I'd like to go back to kind of what we mentioned briefly earlier,
Okay.
and it seems today that Machiavelli is a very influential figure. I guess people are reading The Prince, and not that there's anything wrong with reading that, but I don't almost get the impression that people think that we should act Machiavellian politically to get what we want, and that isn't exactly what is. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to act prudently because when we think about being Machiavellian, and I guess that whether or not Machiavelli was actually like what our common conception of Machiavelli is not really the point. But when we commonly think about it, we almost think about like scheming and deceiving and doing whatever we need to do to get to the end, and whatever means it takes to get to our goal. That's what matters. And if we just think about our definition of prudence, that's not that might get you results, but that's not going to make you a prudent person.
So I think another thing that I can kind of glean from what you just said is that prudence isn't just about being self-centered, because I think you can be very, in a sense, wise and tactful in your actions, and you can, be a prudent person for the sake of self-gain. But being prudence requires being a part of a greater community and working for the good of that greater community. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also add that, kind of related to that, is if we think about prudence, it's recognizing what is objectively true. And if we're actually recognizing what is true, that's going to make us humble. So part of, I guess maybe a result of prudence should be humility. Someone who isn't humble is not really a they're not really they're not really a prudent person. They might think they're prudent, maybe they make smart decisions, but when it comes to themselves, they don't see clearly about themselves. They don't act and judge themselves in a way that is true to reality.
Right. And I think that that's a key that you just mentioned, is that to be prudent, you have to kind of operate within reality. You can't give yourself some misconceptions about the world, or, as Brian just alluded to, about yourself, which, humility, it really is knowing yourself and kind of knowing the world around you. And we'll go into humility in a different episode, I know for sure. But if you don't operate in reality and you create these false constructs of everything around you, you're not really wise. I wouldn't say a man is wise if he knows all about the J.R.R. Tolkien world from Lord of the Rings and thinks that he operates within that world, if he can't make prudent decisions outside of that framework.
Yeah, I would say that this kind of brings up maybe one of the main issues with the way people think about masculinity today is that you kind of have this red pill mindset, and some things there are true. They're kind of reacting to this rejection of traditional masculinity, but there's other things there that are not prudent. Maybe deceiving a woman to get what you want, or acting like a real jerk to impress people. Like those might get you what you're looking for, but they're not true to reality. They're just. Mm-hmm. I think you can look around and you see a lot of people talking about for example, I think of like Conor McGregor in the UFC, and he has this. I think there's this book called like The Secret or something like that. Essentially, like you create your own reality, you will it into existence, and you just decide however you want it to be, and that's completely contrary to what it means to be prudent. You might be able to get results that way, but you're not going to be a virtuous person. And I think people can see that.
Have you seen the image of that statue of kind of a Greek god-looking man, chiseling away from the bottom half of himself out of a block of marble?
Yeah,
what I'm
yeah, I
referring
think
to?
so.
Yes. So, and we'll put a picture in the show notes for those that have not seen it. But that's a very famous statue, and I think that kind of speaks to this, is because in some ways there are good things about that, because we are in control in some respects of our destiny. But to think that we can control everything is imprudent, because you're not acting in that framework of reality. And to think that because you will something into existence means that it will happen, well, that's simply not true in a lot of cases. Now, again, what we're not saying is don't try. We're not saying that you should just, become a nihilist or bemoan your existence, because, if you're a 400-pound man, it's going to take a lot of will and a lot of effort to get from a 400-pound man to a 150-pound man. There's no way around that. But you really do need to still kind of realize there are limits to everything. And I really think that is something that a lot of people don't believe, they don't believe nowadays.
Yeah, I think we have this, this common idea of self-esteem, where, you kind of have to puff yourself up to actually make something of yourself, so you actually can operate and kind of get the goals that you want to achieve. So, for example, maybe you want to be a power lifter and I don't know, bench 500 pounds or whatever your goal might be.
I would like that, yes.
But you can't just go to the gym the first day and be like, I'm a 500-pound bench presser. Like that. Like, you might say, I want to bench 500 pounds, but you can't just show up and say, I'm someone who can do this. It's and I think that's kind of obviously it's imprudent, because you're saying about something about yourself that's not true. It's not true. Everyone who does something like that, they know it's not true. They're just saying that because they think it's going to bring about, they think it's going to make them achieve this goal. But in reality, what's going to make them achieve this goal is by deliberating and say, okay, how can I reach this? I need to go to the gym 5 days a week. I need to go for 2 hours or whatever it might be. But, thinking through and deliberating and seeing how you can actually get to this goal, and, sitting there and talking about, I'm going to do this, is never going to get you there. Putting in the work is what's going to get you there. And that's what is prudent.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think a lot of men, particularly young men nowadays, they, if they're in a bad position in their life, and it could be, we'll continue with the fitness analogy. If you're a man that is really skinny or really fat or whatever it is, and you want to become the power lifter that can bench press 500 pounds, as Brian alluded to, if you sit here and spend the next 24 hours just researching and crafting the perfect plan, how you can go from your current skinny or fat or whatever state to the next 500-pound bench presser, and you never actually follow through, then you're not being prudent. And I think more importantly, something to consider, maybe not too hard, but something to consider, is that you can overthink things. And I think there is a balance in this two sides of prudence, this right reason and this action. And if you kind of lean more towards action, you're jumping into things hastily. If you lean more towards reason, you may never even act, because your brain's releasing dopamine for even just thinking about this plan. And your brain, by releasing these chemicals, you're kind of experiencing the reward of as if you were lifting 500 pounds way ahead of time, way before you should be, because you're still a skinnier fat man.
Right. Yeah, I think that to kind of look at it another way, you might have this whole plan that you come up with, and like you said, you can overanalyze it. And to some extent, being open-minded to different approaches, taking advice from people, that is part of prudence. If you aren't open to reality, if you're not open to learning something, you're not going to be prudent. But at the same time, if you don't act on that, that's not prudent either. So it kind of takes a balance there. You have to be open to understanding things, open to finding the right way. But at some point you actually have to do something about it. Otherwise, you're just going to be open to everything, and then, well, you're really not latching on to what is objectively true. You're just, agnostic about everything.
Right. And we'll give you some more practical applications in the next episode on how you can kind of direct that reason. How you can kind of direct your focus in being prudent, because I think for a lot of people probably want to be prudent. A lot of people want to make smart decisions, particularly if you're a young guy and you maybe just graduated from college and spent most of your 4 years or however long you spent there drinking and partying, and now you're in the real world and the real world is hitting you in the face. In that case, you may be seeking prudence whether you realize it or not. And I think a lot of people go about it wrong because, again, you're trying to do too much at once. You're trying to overthink things. You're trying to jump in without acting, or you're trying to act without thinking. And there really is a balancing act. And that is another part of virtue, is virtue isn't really an extreme, which I think a lot of people have a misconception about as well, that virtue is on the opposite side of vice, that being prudent in many regards is the exact opposite, the polar opposite of being the guy that goes out at college, and spends every night drinking and waking up hungover the next morning.
Right. I'd like to add just one more thing. I think we kind of covered all the different ways that we can be imprudent or maybe misunderstand prudence. I think there's one more that we might have touched on but not really got into, and that's it's related to the decisiveness. So we think about prudence, and you have to deliberate, you have to make a judgment, and then you have to act on it. But once you've acted on that, it's important that you're decisive. If you act on it and then you second guess yourself, and you're wondering and questioning yourself, that also is not prudent, because you're essentially saying, you're essentially questioning, okay, did I was I open to what was I did I deliberate, did I make the right choice? And well, if you were prudent, you would have deliberated properly and you would have made the right choice, so that you don't really have to think about that. Now, obviously, there's an openness to reality and maybe learning from our mistakes, but at the same time, if we're just thinking about what it means to be prudent, a prudent person isn't going to second guess themselves after they've made a decision and acted on it, because they know that they've already deliberated on it and made the right judgment.
Right. There's not that anxiety that did I do the right thing afterwards, which I feel like a lot of people have nowadays. A lot of men are taught not to be decisive. And that's really a problem, because in a society without decisiveness, you get a lot of, well, what do you want? What do you want? Everyone trying to hold the door for each other, and there's no progress, because we're just kind of stuck around this. In many regards, I think a lot of people view it as being polite to be indecisive, because it's, well, I want to bow down towards you, and, but no, I'm going to bow down towards you because, really you're the person that should make the decision. And at the end of the day, no decision is made. So this anxiety and this lack of decisiveness, these are two things that we're definitely going to talk about how you can combat in our next episode. And before we get into that and wrap up the show, Brian, are there any other examples of imprudence or misconceptions that you think we have not covered tonight?
No, I honestly think that's... I'm sure there are, but I think we've covered the main ones.
Right. When we were in your positions, oh dear listeners, these are the things that we were probably thinking about prudence incorrectly. So if you're listening to this and you're still with us, you may be thinking, well, they just described everything that I am, all of the ways that I'm imprudent, all of these misconceptions that I have. But fear not, because in our next episode, which will be released next week, we are going to give you a framework for how to be more prudent. We're going to give you practical applications, and this next 30-minute episode, it's going to be great. We're going to walk you through all the things you need to do to take steps today to build up this habit of prudence. And I think also our plan is to put together a bit of a resource to put on our website that you can use as a handy reference guide kind of like, the stepping stones of prudence in many ways. But with that being said, we are going to wrap up for today. I want to thank you all again for listening to the Vital Masculinity podcast and committing yourselves to wanting to become better, more complete men. Please go check us out at our website, vitalmasculinity.org. Join the conversation about masculinity on Facebook. Leave a rating and review and share this if these questions tonight have piqued your interest. And before we wrap up, we're going to get to the daily deed. Now, Brian, what is this daily deed for this week?
Yeah, so this daily deed is similar to one we had, I think it was either last episode or a couple episodes before that. But essentially, so we talked about misconceptions today about prudence. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take, let's say, 2 minutes every day for the next week and just think about prudence and think about what has my conception of prudence been in the... What have I thought about prudence growing up and up to this point in my life? And think about the misconceptions that we talked about and see maybe where you agree, where your conception agrees, and where maybe you need some work to grow in prudence, I guess. So, and then you can look forward to our next episode after you've considered this, kind of focusing in on, okay, well, these are my misconceptions. Well, now I can kind of focus on this is what I can do to improve on those.
Yeah, as the Greeks said, know thyself. And 2 minutes a day. I mean, I think we can all find 2 minutes a day, morning or evening or at lunch or whenever. It really shouldn't be that hard. But we look forward to having these conversations and hearing on our Facebook group about how you've thought about prudence before, how you have been prudent or been imprudent in your life, and starting to get some ideas about what you're going to do and what we're going to do to become more prudent men. Thank you again for listening, and remember, virtue makes the man.